The night was supposed to be just another high-profile talk show appearance for Tom Cruise. The set was glistening under the bright studio lights, the crowd buzzing with excitement, expecting the usual banter, the charming smile, the polished star persona that made Tom Cruise an icon. He was well rehearsed, as always, the conversation flowing smoothly, until Caroline Levitt's husband entered the equation. Caroline had been invited as the special guest, a rising star in the political world. Her charm and sharp intellect had already won over the audience, and her husband, an influential figure in his own right, had been quietly seated in the front row. He wasn't a media personality, and that was part of the allure. A successful businessman, yet humble and mostly reserved. But when Tom noticed him sitting there, something in him shifted. The crowd might have been there for Karoline, but the dynamics were about to change in a way no one could have predicted. The conversation had been light at first, talk of movies, fame, and recent projects. But Tom, always one to push boundaries, and never shy from controversy, seemed to be waiting for something. The question was, what? Caroline, in the middle of explaining her latest initiative, had barely noticed that the tone in the studio was beginning to shift, but those who were paying attention could sense the change. It was subtle at first, a faint shift in Tom's posture, a flicker of something in his eyes. He leaned forward in his chair, his trademark grin turning just a little too wide, his voice just a touch too cutting. "So, Caroline, I hear your husband's a big deal in the business world," Tom said casually, but there was a bite in his words. The audience chuckled nervously, sensing the impending joke. Caroline smiled politely, clearly unaware of what was about to unfold. "Oh, he's a private man," Caroline said, her tone warm but careful. "He prefers to stay out of the limelight." Tom's eyes gleamed with mischief. "Really? Because, when you marry someone with such a high-profile, resume, it can be hard to stay out of the limelight." He paused, the smirk never leaving his face. "I mean, he must know by now that the cameras always find a way to make even the most modest guy a target, don't you think?" The crowd erupted into nervous laughter, some unsure of how to respond, others clearly uncomfortable with the sudden shift in tone. Caroline's smile faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly, brushing it off with a playful response. But the tension in the air was palpable, the subtle dig hanging there like a low hum in the background. Tom wasn't finished. The next words tumbled out, dripping with that characteristic blend of charm and cutting sarcasm. "But I guess, in your case, Caroline, being married to a guy like that must be great for your, image." His gaze slid toward Caroline's husband, who had been sitting quietly, his face unreadable. The mention of image was deliberate. Tom knew exactly what he was doing. The audience fell into a tense silence, the laughter from before now replaced by a collective intake of breath. Caroline's husband remained still, his expression unreadable. But Caroline's eyes flashed with something else: anger, frustration, maybe even a hint of disbelief. Was this really happening? Was Tom Cruise, a man she had admired for years, mocking her husband like this on live television? She shifted in her seat, but before she could respond, Tom continued, the words spilling out before anyone had the chance to process them. "I've seen your husband on occasion," he said casually, a mock innocent tilt to his head. "And I've got to say, it's hard to imagine someone so serious being married to someone as vibrant and dynamic as you." The implication was clear. He was questioning her choice in partners, insinuating that her husband's somber nature was somehow out of place, as though he didn't belong in her world of politics and public attention. The sting of the insult landed hard. Caroline's hand tightened around the armrest, her knuckles white. She had spent years building her own career, earning respect, becoming a force to be reckoned with in a world that often underestimated her. And now, Tom Cruise of all people, was throwing her husband under the bus for no apparent Reason? Turning him into the butt of his joke, all for the sake of a few laughs. Was this just Tom being Tom? Was it all in good fun, or had something darker shifted beneath the surface? Karoline didn't know. All she knew was that it didn't feel right. The atmosphere had gone from light-hearted to uncomfortable in a matter of seconds, and she was beginning to wonder if this was all part of some game Tom had decided to play, at her husband's expense. The audience was still reeling from the exchange, unsure how to react. The show had taken a strange, unsettling turn, and everyone could sense that something was about to happen. But no one could have anticipated the moment that would follow. When Karoline's husband finally stood up, walking toward the stage, his expression hardening as he made his way to Tom's side. What would happen next? Would he take the high road and let Tom's words roll off his back? Or was this about to turn into something far bigger, something no one could have predicted? The atmosphere in the studio had shifted from tense to downright electric. The audience, once caught in the aftershock of Tom's insults, now watched in stunned silence as Karoline's husband stood up from his seat. His movements were deliberate, controlled, but his eyes told a different story. Anger and a quiet determination burned in them. He wasn't the type to engage in public drama, much less challenge one of Hollywood's most famous stars. But something had snapped in him. He wasn't about to sit there while his wife was publicly humiliated. As he made his way toward the stage, the audience could feel the energy change. It was like the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees. The once buzzing crowd, now holding its collective breath. Karoline shot a glance at her husband, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and concern. She hadn't expected this, had never imagined he would confront Tom so directly. But there was no turning back now. Tom, still sitting in his chair with that signature smirk on his face, hadn't noticed Karoline's husband advancing toward him. He was too caught up in his own bravado, still underestimating the man he had mocked. In that moment, Tom seemed almost untouchable. His years of stardom had shielded him from any real consequences. But Karoline's husband had no intention of letting that illusion continue. He reached the edge of the stage and paused for a moment, locking eyes with Tom. There was no bluster, no bravado in his stance, just quiet, unyielding authority. Tom's smile faltered for a second as he saw the steely determination in the man's eyes. This wasn't the reaction he had anticipated. Karoline's husband took a deep breath, then spoke in a voice that was calm but laced with undeniable intensity. "You know, Tom, I get it. You're a big deal. You've spent decades charming the world, getting away with whatever you want, saying whatever you want, without any real consequence." He paused for a beat, his words hitting like slow, deliberate punches. "But what you don't get is that some of us don't have to play that game. Some of us don't let you tear people down just because it makes you feel bigger." The words hung in the air for a moment. The studio was silent, not a single sound breaking the tension. Karoline's heart raced in her chest as she watched the scene unfold, not knowing whether this would end in a full-blown confrontation or a quiet, uncomfortable retreat. Tom, who had been so confident just moments before, now looked taken aback. His trademark smile had disappeared, replaced with a flicker of surprise. Then something else. It wasn't fear, not quite, but a recognition that this wasn't a fight he could easily win. He had crossed a line, and now he was faced with the uncomfortable reality of having to answer for it. The audience was on edge, waiting for Tom's response. Would he continue with his playful mocking, or would he backpedal? The tension was unbearable. Tom cleared his throat, the mask of confidence, slipping just a little. "Look, I didn't mean to offend anyone," he said, his voice wavering slightly, an edge of uncertainty creeping in. It was a sharp contrast to his earlier bravado. "I was just having a little fun," but Karoline's husband wasn't buying it. His eyes remained locked on Tom, unwavering. "Fun? At someone else's expense? You think that's fun?" His voice had grown more intense now, no longer just a calm rebuttal, but a clear challenge. "You're a grown man, Tom. You don't get to mock people like they're part of some joke you're telling. That's not humor. It's cruelty." The words hit hard, and for a moment Tom's composure faltered. He had built his career on being the charming, untouchable star, the one who could get away with anything with just a smile and a laugh. But now, that carefully constructed image seemed to be crumbling before his eyes. Karoline's husband, a man who had no public persona to defend, no fame to rely on, was exposing the cracks in Tom's armor. And it was a sight no one in the studio had ever seen before. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting from Karoline's husband to the audience, who had gone completely silent, hanging on every word. The once mighty star, known for his high-profile roles and world-famous status, now looked small. His usual charm had abandoned him, and in its place was the uneasy realization that he had underestimated the man sitting in front of him. "You've had your fun," Karoline's husband continued, his voice now a steady, authoritative force. "But it's time to stop pretending. You've made your living off of putting others down, but tonight, you just met someone who won't let you get away with it. Not anymore." The studio lights seemed to shine down on Karoline's husband, almost as if the universe itself was highlighting this pivotal moment. The audience, initially unsure of what would unfold, now found themselves rooting for the man who had been pushed too far. He wasn't just defending his wife. He was standing up to a system of celebrity entitlement that had gotten away with far too much for far too long. And just like that, the narrative had shifted. Tom Cruise, the man who had once been untouchable, was now the one on the defensive. It was clear that the tables had turned. Karoline's husband had not only confronted Tom, but had forced him to acknowledge his own weaknesses, his own arrogance, and the true cost of his words. Tom opened his mouth, but no words came out. The audience was waiting for him to say something, anything to salvage the situation. But in that moment he had no answer. The confrontation had already been won, not by words, but by the simple act of standing up, of not backing down. As Karoline's husband turned to walk back to his seat, the silence in the studio was deafening. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence anymore. It was a silence filled with respect, with acknowledgement of a battle won. Tom Cruise, for all his fame, for all his power, had just been reminded of something that not even his star power could protect him from: being held accountable. The studio was buzzing with the aftershocks of what had just transpired. The crowd, who had once adored Tom Cruise, now looked at him with a new kind of curiosity, one tinged with a mix of disbelief and uncertainty. It was clear to everyone present. This was no longer just a light-hearted celebrity interview. This was a moment of reckoning, a battle for pride, respect, and public perception. Karoline's husband returned to his seat, his movements calm, but the intensity in his eyes hadn't faded. He wasn't interested in fame or recognition. He wasn't there to challenge Tom for the world to see. He was there because his wife had been publicly disrespected, and someone needed to step up for her. But as he sat down beside Karoline, the camera zoomed in on his face, and the audience couldn't help but notice the way he had taken control of the situation. He had done what so few others dared to do. He had called out one of the world's most famous stars, not with anger, but with quiet, measured authority. Tom, meanwhile, was still processing what had just happened. His smirk was gone, replaced by a furrowed brow. His mind raced, and the charm that had so often shielded him from the consequences of his actions seemed to evaporate before his eyes. It was a rare sight. Tom Cruise, the man who had mastered the art of winning audiences with ease, now struggling to find the right words. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The tension in the room was palpable, and Tom could feel the weight of every eye in the studio on him. It wasn't just Karoline's husband who had put him in his place. It was the entire audience, the collective realization that someone had finally stood up to the untouchable Tom Cruise. Finally, Tom cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he turned back to Karoline and her husband. "Look," he began, his usual confidence failing him. "I didn't mean to go that far. It was a joke, but I guess I crossed a line. I can own up to that." His words were an attempt at redemption, but they felt hollow, as though the weight of the moment had drained all the sincerity from them. Karoline looked at him, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't about to let him off that easily. "You don't get to just apologize and pretend nothing happened, Tom. What you said wasn't just a joke, it was an attack," she said, her voice steady but firm. "You mocked my husband, and in doing so you insulted both of us. It wasn't funny, it wasn't clever, it was cruel." For the first time in the interview, the studio seemed to rally behind her. The audience, who had been nervous and uncertain just moments ago, now seemed to be united in their support. The energy had shifted. People weren't here to see Tom Cruise's charm anymore. They wanted to see accountability. Tom looked around at the crowd, sensing the shift in the air. The polite laughter that had followed his earlier remarks was long gone. The audience's gaze had turned, and they weren't looking at him with adoration anymore. They were looking at him with judgment. And Tom knew it. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Tom stammered, his usual bravado slipping further with each word. "You know how it is sometimes in the entertainment business. You push boundaries, try to make things interesting. But it's clear now that I made a mistake. And for that, I'm sorry." But Karoline wasn't finished. She could feel the weight of the moment, the importance of holding Tom accountable. "Apologies don't change what happened, Tom. We all know you can laugh it off, and the media might even spin this as just a little misunderstanding. But the truth is, you crossed a line, and not just with me, but with the people you've spent years entertaining. It's about respect, and that's something you don't get to take lightly." The room was silent, the gravity of her words settling over everyone. Karoline's voice was calm, yet powerful, and it felt like the air itself had thickened with the weight of her conviction. Tom Cruise, for the first time in his career, was facing a public reckoning that wasn't just about a celebrity feud. It was about something much deeper. It was about the power dynamics that existed between the rich and famous and the rest of the world. It was about the privilege of being untouchable, and how that privilege could be challenged. The truth was, the apology felt like a half-hearted attempt, a quick fix to avoid further fallout. Karoline saw through it. She wasn't interested in a surface-level resolution. She wanted more. She wanted change. But that didn't mean the story was over. Far from it. As the show continued, Karoline's husband, who had stood up in defense of his wife, remained quiet. His role in this moment had already been made clear. He wasn't there to bask in any newfound glory. He wasn't looking for a public victory. But as the camera zoomed out, capturing his composed demeanor, it was clear to anyone watching, Karoline's husband had won this battle. The crowd had finally begun to understand the true significance of what had just happened. Tom Cruise, once the king of Hollywood, was no longer the invincible star who could do no wrong. For once, he had been shown that his words carried weight, that his actions had consequences. And the audience had witnessed it in real time. As the show wrapped up, the tone was markedly different from when it had started. Tom Cruise, a man known for his towering presence, had been brought down to earth, forced to confront the reality that not even his fame could shield him from the repercussions of his actions. But was this the end of it for Tom? Would he learn from this moment, or would his apology be nothing more than an attempt to save face? Only time would tell. The aftermath of the encounter between Tom Cruise and Karoline's husband sent shockwaves through the media world. The interview, which had originally been planned as a light-hearted, casual discussion, was now the focal point of every headline and news outlet across the globe. It was no longer just a celebrity gaffe. It was a turning point, not just for Tom Cruise, but for the entire world of public figures who had long relied on their untouchable status. As the dust began to settle, the repercussions became increasingly clear. Tom Cruise, the once invincible megastar, had been taken down a peg. The apology, though sincere in its delivery, had done little to quell the storm. The damage had been done, and no amount of charm could erase the fact that he had mocked Karoline's husband, a man who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from standing up for what he believed in. Social media exploded with reactions. Fans of both Tom and Karoline weighed in, but the overwhelming sentiment was that of disappointment. People who had once admired Tom's ability to make light of any situation now saw him in a new light, less the charming movie star, and more, a man who had used his power to belittle someone who could not fight back. The debate raged across Twitter, Instagram, and every corner of the internet. But it wasn't just the public who was holding Tom accountable. Behind the scenes, the networks and production studios that had once clamored to work with him were now beginning to distance themselves. There was talk of pulling sponsorships, revising marketing plans, and even reconsidering the roles that Tom had been previously slated to take on. The once unquestioned loyalty of the entertainment industry to its stars was beginning to fray at the edges, and Tom was at the epicenter of it all. Meanwhile, Karoline and her husband had returned home, their minds still reeling from the events of the day. Karoline couldn't help but feel a sense of victory, not for herself, but for her husband, for the quiet strength he had shown in the face of a public humiliation. He hadn't let Tom's mockery slide. He had stood up, not just for his own dignity, but for the dignity of others. And in that moment, he had become a symbol of something far more powerful than celebrity status: the ability to speak truth to power and hold it accountable. Her husband, however, had a different perspective. He wasn't looking for applause or validation. "I just didn't want anyone thinking it was okay to treat people like that," he said quietly as they sat on the couch later that evening. His words were humble, almost to the point of self-deprecation. But Karoline knew better. He hadn't just stood up for her. He had shown the world that there was more to life than fame and fortune. That respect was something that couldn't be bought, no matter how many awards or accolades one had. The fallout for Tom Cruise was far from over. The media frenzy continued as more and more stories came out, dissecting every moment of the interview, analyzing Tom's apology, and speculating on what might come next for his career. Critics called for him to do more than simply apologize. They wanted him to take real responsibility, to show that he understood the weight of his words and the harm they had caused. Tom, for his part, attempted to move on from the incident. He gave interviews, tried to laugh it off, and even made light of his own mistake in the hopes of regaining some of his former charm. But the public wasn't buying it. The sincerity of his apology was questioned by nearly everyone, and the idea that this was just another Tom Cruise moment fell flat. It wasn't the usual Tom Cruise brand that the world had grown so accustomed to seeing. People wanted more than a quick recovery. They wanted accountability. The studio, too, found itself under pressure. Questions were raised about how it had allowed such an event to occur, and why Tom's behavior had been so readily accepted in the past. People were beginning to wonder, was this a one-off incident, or was it the culmination of years of unchecked arrogance from Hollywood's elite? But in the midst of all this, Karoline and her husband stood unshaken. They had emerged from the ordeal stronger, their bond solidified by the events of that day. The attention on them, while overwhelming, didn't seem to affect their daily lives. They had done what they needed to do, not for the accolades, but for the principle of it. And as the media cycle churned on, they knew that their actions had made an impact that would resonate long after the cameras were turned off. Tom Cruise, on the other hand, was left to grapple with the consequences of his actions. Would he learn from this moment and become a more humble, self-aware public figure? Or would he continue to lean on his celebrity status, assuming that the world would eventually forgive and forget? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. The world had changed. Tom Cruise was no longer the untouchable star he once was. His fame had been tarnished, and the public's perception of him would never be the same again. And Karoline? She had made her point. Her husband had made his point. In the end, they had stood firm, shown courage, and in doing so, had shifted the balance of power in a way no one could have anticipated. The dust from the Tom Cruise controversy had not yet fully settled, but Karoline and her husband were no longer focused on the media frenzy. Their lives, despite the relentless spotlight, had regained a sense of calm. The media might have moved on, but the impact of what had happened on that live TV show lingered in the air, leaving an indelible mark on both Hollywood and the world beyond. For Tom Cruise, the weeks that followed were a whirlwind of apologies, interviews, and public relations, campaigns designed to salvage what remained of his reputation. But nothing seemed to work. The audiences had seen behind the curtain, and what they found wasn't the charming, larger-than-life star they had once adored. Instead, they saw a man who had, for the first time in his career, been forced to confront his own limitations. The carefully crafted image of Tom Cruise as the invincible movie star was now cracked, exposed for all to see. And it wasn't just the public who had witnessed this shift. Industry insiders and executives who had once flocked to work with him now hesitated, unsure whether it was worth the risk of associating with someone whose actions were now under such intense scrutiny. Meanwhile, Karoline and her husband continued to live their lives without regret, unwavering in the knowledge that they had done the right thing. They hadn't asked for the spotlight, and they certainly hadn't sought revenge or recognition. But in standing up to Tom, they had become unwitting symbols of accountability. People across the world took notice of how they handled the situation, not with vindictiveness, but with quiet strength and a steadfast commitment to what was right. For Karoline's husband, the experience was both humbling and empowering. He had never imagined that standing up to a Hollywood legend would have such a profound impact. He had only acted out of a sense of respect for his wife, for himself, and for everyone who had ever been disrespected or belittled by someone in power. And now, he understood the weight of that decision. His actions had reverberated far beyond that TV studio, sparking a conversation that many people had been afraid to have for years. How often had celebrities, politicians, and powerful figures used their platform to make jokes at the expense of others? How often had they been allowed to walk away unscathed, their words never carrying the consequences they should? As the months passed, Karoline and her husband found themselves taking on new roles, advocates for dignity, fairness, and respect in all aspects of public life. They didn't seek the spotlight, but it had found them. Their story became a touchstone for those who believed that standing up to power, no matter how high the stakes, was worth it. People from all walks of life reached out to them, thanking them for showing the world that it was possible to challenge the status quo and make a real difference. Tom Cruise, for his part, continued to rebuild his career, though it was clear that the road ahead was not as smooth as it had once been. The media had moved on, but the world's perception of him had changed irrevocably. It wasn't that people had forgotten who he was or the legacy he had built. It was that they had seen his vulnerability, his human side, and for many, it wasn't enough to excuse his past actions. For some, the apology was too little, too late. For others, it was simply a reminder that even the most powerful stars are not immune to the consequences of their actions. And yet, despite the fallout, Tom still had his fans, loyal followers who continued to support him, even in the wake of his misstep. But these supporters were no longer the majority. The dynamic had shifted, and the relationship between public figures and their audiences was forever changed. The expectation of celebrity invincibility had been shattered. People no longer looked at Tom as the untouchable star. They looked at him as just another human being who could make mistakes, just like anyone else. But what of Karoline and her husband? Their actions had proved something far greater than a simple celebrity feud. They had proven that in a world obsessed with power and fame, there was still room for integrity, for honesty, and for standing up to what was wrong, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The public had witnessed this battle not for fame or fortune, but for something deeper: respect. And in the end, Karoline and her husband had shown everyone that the true measure of a person's worth isn't how much they have, but how they treat others. As the interview with Tom Cruise faded into history, one thing remained clear. A single, unassuming couple had taken on the might of a Hollywood legend, and won. They had reminded the world that power and privilege were not absolute, and that even the most famous figures could be called to account for their actions. And for Tom, that would be a lesson that would follow him for the rest of his life. Ready to make a change, or destined to keep fighting the shadows of his past? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: the balance of power in Hollywood had shifted, and it would never be the same again. This was the story of how a moment of mockery turned into a fight for dignity. A story of resilience, of standing up to giants, and of proving that even the most untouchable stars could be humbled. And, for Karoline and her husband, this was their triumph.